Now, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad put California on the map, as we know, and helped spark an economic boom that would eventually create the largest economy in the United States, fifth largest in the world. Women played a major role in the development, but have largely been left out of the narrative for more than a century. Photojournalist Xavier Uriarte went to the California Railroad Museum in Old Sacramento, where they're working to get the women of the railroad back into history.
California State Railroad Museum was founded in 1981.
At the Railroad Museum, we say that our lives are made of railroad stories and that we tell the stories of the railroad through the stories of people.
Railroad history runs through all of our lives, and in that respect, it is a museum of culture and history that's directly related to our lives. We want people to see themselves in history. There's no more diverse history than railroad history because of all of the people that were involved.
I've been coming to this museum since I was a kid. My grandfather used to bring me here, and I have only seen 2 women in the museum and their mannequins with no stories.
We did an exhibit here at the California State Railroad Museum that was a completely student-run exhibit, and so 16 graduate students chose a subject matter. They chose an area in the museum and they created an exhibit. And one of those students, Nicole Allison, who had no previous interest in railroading, never probably thought about it, through that association and through the work here at the museum, said, what about women? What about women in railroading? And so she wanted to have an intervention that introduced women at every turn of railroad history. And so she decided for her master's thesis at Sac State to produce an exhibit plan. That exhibit plan eventually morphed into Crossing Lines, Women of the American Railroad.
It's really challenging to give historic individuals who are not represented in the majority of historical literature that independent voice. Rosina Tucker wrote a fabulous book about her life. It's her autobiography. She lived until she was 105, and she was an activist her entire life.
Rosina Tucker had an extraordinary life. Her parents actually were enslaved. She was married for about 18 years and her husband passed. She got married a second time, and the second marriage was to a man named Bertram Tucker, and he was a Pullman porter. A Pullman porter would be in charge of one car. They were luxury cars. He was in charge of everything that happened on that car and taking care of all the passengers that traveled on the car. They worked very hard for very low wages. And they wanted to be unionized, but they weren't allowed in the union. But it was a very tricky thing to be developing a union, because any kind of union activity, I think we still see this today. If you know that you're developing a union, you're really putting your job on the line. Getting women involved in helping to create the union would be a really good way of sort of doing this in a way that wasn't very obvious. Because women can get together, they visit each other's homes, and this is exactly what Rosina Tucker did.
Rosina Tucker, who was highly involved in the long attempt to create a Pullman Porters Union. And it turns out to have a brotherhood of Pullman Porters, you needed a sisterhood.
She worked really hard, and she worked hard at convincing the men and their wives that the best way to get their rights, to be paid more, to work fewer hours, is to have a union behind you to fight for your rights. Anna Judah, in her day, in the 1850s, again, what was expected of a woman? She came from a wealthy family. She was married to a professional man. What would have been expected of her at that time is to take care of the home and to get involved in charity work. She got very involved with supporting her husband, and not only supporting him, but accompanying him in accomplishing this dream. He got the job working with the Sacramento Valley Railroad, but he always had this dream for the Transcontinental Railroad. He lobbied Washington, D.C. That meant that he was going from California back to Washington, D.C. Yep, he went back and forth about 4 or 5 times, and Anna accompanied him on all of these. She organized the paperwork. She accompanied him in the trips that he took up to the Sierra. She was a wonderful artist. She painted watercolors. She collected samples of the flowers there. This was all part of the presentation that Judah made to the lawmakers to get their approval. In one of the letters that I read that Theodore wrote to his wife, to Anna, and he says, you know, I'd love it if you came up here, but you better make yourself a pair of pantaloons. So don't come in your dress. You need to wear pants, but women didn't wear pants, right? So, and it's not like she could just go to the store and buy a pair. She had to make herself some pantaloons and put on those boots, and then she went up to the Sierra. So she was a woman that we say was ahead of her time. And if it wasn't for her, would Theodore Judah have been as successful at what he did? If it wasn't for her wanting to come to California in the first place, what would that have been like? What would that have done to, I think about history? Would the Transcontinental Railroad have been built the way it was? Would it have been here in Sacramento? You know, I don't know, but Anna, of course, accompanied him, and that's what happened.
It's a well-rounded, well-conceived, complex, nuanced story about women and the various contributions and interactions that they had with American railroading.
Every single one of the women in this exhibit had a huge impact on the railroad. We're talking about the history of all of these women and their impacts, and I couldn't choose one of them to have the most impact because they all had great impact. I feel like history is compounding, you know? Even the smallest impact of Anna Judah sorting Theodore Judah's notes to take to Congress to ask for the Transcontinental Railroad has changed the country forever. For me to see women here reflects myself. And so now I see, oh, there are women throughout history who have made impact, and I can make that kind of impact too.